Just a secretary. Mr. Harrison spat, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor of the 42nd floor conference room. Know your place, Carmel. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The words hit harder than the stack of contracts he'd just thrown at my desk. 23 floors below, Manhattan hummed with possibility, but up here in the executive suite of Meridian Financial, I was apparently nothing more than a coffee-fetching, appointment-scheduling decoration. That was 3 months ago. What Mr. Harrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman they dismissed as just a secretary had been quietly reshaping their company from the inside out. And when the board meeting started in exactly 17 minutes, when Chairman Phillips stood up and said those 4 words that would change everything, Harrison's world would collapse faster than his overpriced stock portfolio. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a small-town girl from Ohio became the invisible force behind Wall Street's most ruthless corporate machine, and how the man who tried to humiliate me learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones hiding in plain sight. The morning it all started, I was 27 minutes early to work, same as always. The elevator to the 42nd floor was empty except for me and the faint scent of yesterday's cigar smoke that seemed permanently embedded in the mahogany panels. My reflection stared back from the polished steel doors. Navy blue blazer, pearl earrings, hair pulled back in the kind of professional bun that screamed competent but not threatening. Carmel Peterson, that's what my nameplate read. What it didn't mention was the MBA from Wharton, the 3 languages I spoke fluently, or the fact that I'd been quietly running financial analysis on Meridian's biggest deals for the past 18 months while pretending to just schedule meetings and order lunch. The reception desk on the executive floor was positioned strategically, close enough to the conference room to hear everything, far enough to be ignored. I'd learned to use that positioning like a weapon. While the senior partners argued about quarterly projections, I was already running the numbers they'd need next week. While they debated merger strategies, I was researching the target company's hidden liabilities. "Carmel!" Harrison's voice boomed from his corner office. "Where's my 9:30? I glanced at the Cartier watch on my wrist. A gift from someone these people would never expect. "Mr. Brennan is in the elevator, sir. Should arrive in 45 seconds. Harrison emerged from his office, adjusting his Hermes tie. At 54, he was the kind of man who wore his success like cologne. Too much, too obvious. His corner office overlooked Central Park. His car was a Tesla Model S, and his ego was bigger than both combined. What he lacked in actual financial acumen, he made up for with bluster and a network of golf buddies who threw deals his way. "And my coffee? Ethiopian single origin, 2 sugars, splash of cream, on your desk." He didn't thank me, he never did. In Harrison's world, secretaries existed to make his life easier. Not to be acknowledged as human beings with thoughts, feelings, or capabilities beyond basic administrative tasks. The elevator dinged, and Michael Brennan stepped out, senior partner at Goldman Sachs, the kind of man who could make or break deals with a single phone call. He nodded politely at me, one of the few who actually saw me as more than office furniture. "Carmel, how's the family?" "Very well, thank you for asking, Mr. Brennan." Harrison's jaw tightened. He hated when clients engaged with me directly, as if their politeness somehow diminished his authority. "Michael, ready to discuss the Hartwell acquisition?" As they disappeared into the conference room, I returned to my desk and opened the file I'd been working on. The Hartwell deal was Harrison's baby, a $200 million acquisition of a small tech company that he was convinced would revolutionize Meridian's portfolio. What Harrison didn't know was that I'd spent the past month digging into Hartwell's financials, and what I'd found would make any rational investor run screaming. Hidden debt, inflated user numbers, a CEO with a gambling problem, and a CFO who'd been cooking the books for 2 years. The due diligence report Harrison had commissioned was surface level at best, probably because he'd chosen the cheapest firm available. But I'd gone deeper, using resources and contacts that a mere secretary shouldn't have had access to. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Board meeting moved to 2 p.m. Urgent matters to discuss. -J. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. Some secrets were worth keeping, even from myself. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Phone calls to route, meetings to schedule, documents to format. I'd become an expert at looking busy while actually doing the work that kept this place running. When Harrison emerged from his meeting with Brennan, he was practically glowing. "Carmel, set up a lunch meeting with the Hartwell people tomorrow if possible, Pierre." "Of course, sir." I made the note, knowing it would be the last lunch meeting Harrison would ever have as a Meridian partner. The afternoon brought the usual parade of junior associates, each one treating me like an extension of the office equipment. There was Bradley Chen, the Harvard Law graduate, who spoke to me in the same tone he might use with Siri. Jennifer Walsh, the former McKinsey consultant who acted like administrative work, was beneath her notice. And Marcus Williams, the Princeton MBA who'd tried to ask me out exactly once, before I'd made it clear that some lines shouldn't be crossed. "Carmel, I need you to reschedule my 3 o'clock, Marcus said, not looking up from his phone. "Push it to Thursday." "Your 3 o'clock is with the Japanese delegation. They flew in specifically for this meeting." So rescheduling would be incredibly disrespectful and could jeopardize the entire Pacific Rim expansion project. Marcus finally looked up, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise. "How do you know about the Pacific Rim project?" I smiled sweetly. "I scheduled the meetings, didn't I?" It was a half-truth. I'd scheduled the meetings, but I'd also spent 6 months researching Asian markets, studying currency fluctuations, and building financial models that would make the expansion profitable. Models that were currently sitting in my locked desk drawer, waiting for the right moment. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me for the first time. "Right, we'll see if you can move it to 4. I'll make it work." As the day wore on, I found myself thinking about the text message, "Board meeting at 2 p.m. In all my time at Meridian, I'd never known a board meeting to be called with such short notice. The quarterly review wasn't for another month, and there were no major deals pending approval. Unless someone had discovered something about the Hartwell acquisition. At 1:45 p.m., I watched as the board members began arriving. Chairman Phillips was first, his silver hair impeccable, his manner calm and controlled. Board members followed. Margaret Stevenson from the pension fund, Robert Chen from the investment bank, Sarah Martinez from the insurance company. These were people who controlled billions of dollars, who made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Harrison paced near the conference room, clearly agitated. He'd been making phone calls all morning, his voice getting progressively more strained with each conversation. When he saw me watching, he snapped his fingers. "Carmel, get me the Hartwell files, all of them." "Which specific documents, sir?" "Everything. The due diligence report, the financial projections, the merger agreement, everything." I gathered the files, my hands steady despite the knowledge of what was coming. As I approached the conference room, I could hear voices through the thick glass, urgent, concerned voices discussing things that would change everything. "Here you are, sir," I said, setting the files on the conference table. Harrison barely glanced at me. "Close the door behind you." But as I reached for the door handle, Chairman Phillips looked up. For just a moment, our eyes met and I saw something there. Recognition, concern, maybe even pride. Then he looked away, and I closed the door. Through the glass, I could see Harrison spreading documents across the table, his gestures becoming more animated as he spoke. The board members listened, their faces growing increasingly serious. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't going well for Harrison. My phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. "It's time." Nash J. I looked up at the conference room, where Harrison was now standing, his face flushed, his hands gesturing wildly. Through the soundproof glass, I could see his mouth moving, but couldn't make out the words. The board members sat in stony silence, their expressions unreadable. Then Chairman Phillips stood up. Even through the glass, I could see the shift in the room's dynamics. Harrison stopped talking mid-sentence, his face going pale. The other board members leaned forward, their attention focused entirely on the chairman. Phillips spoke quietly, calmly, but whatever he said caused Harrison to stumble backward, his hand gripping the edge of the table for support. The color drained from his face as he looked from Phillips to the other board members, then toward the glass wall where I sat at my desk. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. For the first time in 3 years, Harrison was looking at me not as a secretary, but as something else entirely, something that terrified him. I met his gaze steadily, my expression neutral, professional, just a secretary doing her job. But inside, I was smiling. Because Harrison was about to learn what happens when you underestimate the woman who's been quietly building your destruction, one perfectly scheduled meeting at a time. And the man he'd dismissed as just the chairman was about to tell him exactly who I really was. The board meeting was just beginning, but Harrison's career at Meridian Financial was already over. He just didn't know it yet. I straightened my blazer, adjusted my pearl earrings, and prepared to watch the most powerful man in the company learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who've been hiding in plain sight all along. The conference room door was about to open, and with it, Harrison's perfectly constructed world was about to collapse. Just like I'd planned. 3 months earlier, the morning after Harrison's just a secretary comment, I'd arrived at the office with a different purpose. Not revenge. Something far more sophisticated. I was going to systematically dismantle his career, using the one weapon he'd never suspect: competence. The previous evening had been spent in my Upper East Side apartment, surrounded by financial journals, SEC filings, and a bottle of Chateau Margaux that cost more than Harrison's monthly car payment. While he was probably at some trendy Soho restaurant impressing clients with his expense account, I was building a comprehensive analysis of every deal he'd touched in the past 5 years. The pattern was clear. Harrison was a middleman who took credit for other people's work. His successful deals were actually structured by junior associates and approved by senior partners who never bothered to verify his contributions. He was the financial equivalent of a beautiful storefront hiding an empty warehouse. But more importantly, he was sloppy, and sloppy people leave trails. My first target was the Morrison Industries deal from 2 years ago. Harrison had presented it as his masterpiece, a $150 million acquisition that had boosted Meridian's tech portfolio. The press release quoted him extensively, and he'd used it to justify his promotion to senior vice president. What the press release didn't mention was that Morrison Industries was bleeding money. Their flagship software product was already obsolete, their customer base was shrinking, and their main competitor had just launched a superior platform. I'd discovered this through a contact at TechCrunch, someone who owed me a favor from my previous life. My previous life. That was how I thought of it now. The time before I'd decided to disappear into the corporate machinery and observe the predators from the inside. I'd spent my first week back at Meridian after Harrison's insult doing something I'd never done before. I'd started listening to every conversation, reading every email chain I could access, and mapping the real power structure of the company. Not the organizational chart on the wall, but the actual network of relationships, favors, and hidden agendas that determined who succeeded and who failed. The discovery had been startling. Harrison wasn't just incompetent, he was actively damaging the company. His deals were consistently overvalued. His risk assessments were dangerously optimistic, and his management style was driving away talented junior staff. But he was protected by something more powerful than competence. He was Chairman Phillips's golf partner. Or so everyone believed. The irony was delicious. While Harrison bragged about his weekend games at Westchester Country Club, I was having dinner with the chairman every Sunday night. While Harrison name-dropped his Ivy League connections, I was the one who'd introduced Phillips to half the contacts in his personal network. While Harrison purchased expensive suits to project success, I was wearing jewelry that had been in my family for 3 generations. But none of my colleagues knew this. To them, I was exactly what Harrison had called me, just a secretary. I'd cultivated this image carefully. My resume, the one HR had on file, showed a modest background. Community college, a few years at a small accounting firm, standard administrative experience. Nothing threatening. Nothing that would make the senior partners question why someone with my qualifications was answering phones and scheduling meetings. The real resume was locked in my home safe, along with letters of recommendation from professors at Wharton, performance reviews from my previous position at Goldman Sachs, and documentation of the deals I'd actually structured before deciding to step back from the spotlight. My second week of preparation involved something more dangerous. I began documenting everything. Every conversation I overheard, every email I processed, every meeting I attended as the invisible note-taker. I was building a comprehensive record of how Meridian Financial actually operated, as opposed to how it pretended to operate. The revelation was both fascinating and horrifying. The company was essentially a sophisticated shell game, with profits being shuffled between divisions to hide losses, risks being systematically underreported to investors, and regulatory compliance being treated as a minor inconvenience rather than a legal requirement. And Harrison was at the center of it all. Not as the mastermind, he lacked the intelligence for that, but as the perfect fall guy. He was signing documents he didn't understand, making presentations based on analyses he hadn't read, and taking credit for successes while remaining oblivious to the disasters he was creating. My third week brought the first real breakthrough. I was organizing Harrison's files when I discovered a series of emails between him and a consulting firm called Apex Analytics. The emails were vague, but the invoices were specific: $50,000 for market research and competitive analysis on the Hartwell acquisition. Apex Analytics didn't exist. The address was a mail drop in Delaware, the phone number went to voicemail, and the company registration had been filed just 2 weeks before the first invoice. Someone was creating fake consulting firms to justify inflated expenses, and Harrison was either complicit or too stupid to notice. I spent my lunch hours that week tracing the money trail. The payments from Meridian went to a Delaware LLC, which transferred the funds to a Cayman Islands account, which then moved the money to a Swiss bank. It was a classic money laundering scheme, designed to look like legitimate business expenses while actually funneling cash to offshore accounts. The question was, who was behind it? The answer came during my fourth week of investigation, when I was working late and overheard a phone conversation between Harrison and someone he addressed as Rico. The conversation was brief but revealing. "The Hartwell deal is approved," Harrison said. "Full board support. We can move forward with the arrangement." "Excellent," Rico replied. "The consultation fee will be the usual amount." "Of course. Same account?" "Always." After Harrison hung up, I sat in the darkened reception area, processing what I'd heard. Harrison wasn't just incompetent, he was actively stealing from the company. The fake consulting firms, the inflated invoices, the offshore accounts, it was all part of a scheme to skim money from Meridian's biggest deals. But I needed proof. Real proof, not just overheard conversations and suspicious invoices. My fifth week brought the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Harrison was traveling to Los Angeles for a client meeting, leaving me alone with his office and his computer. I'd been memorizing his passwords for months. He used the same combination for everything, the unimaginative fool, and I knew his schedule better than he did. I waited until the cleaning crew had finished their rounds, then let myself into his office. The computer booted up without protest, and I began systematically copying every file, every email, every document that might be relevant to my investigation. What I found exceeded my worst expectations. Harrison had been skimming money from deals for 3 years. Not just the Hartwell acquisition, but dozens of smaller transactions, each one generating a quote, 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 quote. Iterative was pulsing fee. The total amount was staggering. Over $2 million in stolen funds, carefully hidden through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. But there was more. Harrison had been manipulating deal valuations, inflating projections to justify higher fees, and systematically defrauding both the company and its clients. The Morrison Industries deal, the one he'd built his reputation on, was actually a disaster that had cost Meridian nearly $50 million in hidden losses. I copied everything to an encrypted drive, then began the delicate process of building a case. Not the kind of case that would get Harrison fired, that would be too easy. The kind of case that would destroy him completely while simultaneously protecting the company and its innocent employees. My 6th week was spent in preparation for the endgame. I contacted a friend at the Securities and Exchange Commission, someone who owed me a favor from my previous career. I arranged for anonymous tips to be sent to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I prepared a comprehensive report detailing every aspect of Harrison's scheme, complete with documentation and forensic analysis. But most importantly, I began positioning myself as the solution to the problem Harrison had created. The junior associates who'd been doing his actual work. I made sure their contributions were documented and recognized. The deals that were actually profitable, I ensured that credit went to the people who deserved it. The clients who were being defrauded, I began quietly reaching out to them, offering my services as a consultant who could help them avoid future problems. By my 7th week, I had built a shadow organization within Meridian Financial. A network of junior employees who trusted me, clients who relied on my analysis, and senior partners who had begun to notice that their most successful deals all seemed to involve my input. I was no longer just a secretary. I was the invisible hand that kept the company running, the person who solved problems before they became crises, the one who made sure that the right information reached the right people at the right time. And Harrison had no idea. My 8th week brought the first signs that my plan was working. The board had begun asking questions about Harrison's recent deals, particularly the Hartwell acquisition. Chairman Phillips had requested a comprehensive review of all pending transactions, with particular attention to due diligence procedures and consulting expenses. I was the one who prepared the materials for this review, naturally. And I made sure that every questionable transaction, every inflated invoice, every suspicious payment was clearly documented and highlighted. But I also made sure that the review would reveal something else. That the company's most profitable deals, its most successful client relationships, and its most accurate financial analyses all had one thing in common. They all involved input from someone the senior partners had been ignoring. Someone they'd dismissed as just a secretary. The 9th week was when I began to see panic in Harrison's eyes. He'd started making frantic phone calls, staying late at the office, demanding explanations from junior associates who suddenly seemed reluctant to support his version of events. "Carmel," he said one morning, his voice strained, "I need you to find the original Morrison Industries files, the complete set." "Which files specifically, sir?" "All of them, every document, every analysis, every communication. I need to review the entire transaction." I nodded professionally. "I'll have them on your desk within the hour." What I didn't tell him was that the files would reveal his complete incompetence. Every wrong assumption, every missed red flag, every piece of analysis that had been provided by junior staff and then ignored. The Morrison Industries deal would become his burial ground. My 10th week was spent watching Harrison's world slowly collapse. The board review had identified serious problems with his recent deals. The SEC had begun making inquiries about Meridian's consulting expenses. The FBI had started investigating suspicious financial transactions. And through it all, I sat at my desk, answering phones and scheduling meetings, the perfect picture of professional competence. But I was also preparing for the final phase of my plan, the moment when Harrison would learn that the woman he'd dismissed as just a secretary was actually the person who'd been holding his career together, and more importantly, the person who'd just finished tearing it apart. The 11th week brought the emergency board meeting, the one that would determine not just Harrison's fate, but the future of Meridian Financial itself. As I prepared for that meeting, I reflected on what I'd accomplished. In 3 months, I'd transformed myself from a dismissed secretary into the most important person in the company. I documented a massive fraud, protected innocent employees, and positioned myself as the solution to problems that hadn't even been discovered yet. But most importantly, I'd proven that competence doesn't require recognition. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who remain invisible, who let others take credit for their work, who wait patiently for the right moment to reveal exactly who they really are. That moment was about to arrive. And Harrison, who'd called me just a secretary, was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who've been quietly building your destruction while you weren't paying attention. 10. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. It was time to finish what I'd started. The call came on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., while I was reviewing quarterly earnings reports over Ethiopian coffee in my kitchen. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, with the kind of authority that came from controlling billions in assets. "Ms. Peterson, this is Victoria Chen from Blackstone Capital Management. We need to talk." I set down my cup carefully. Blackstone wasn't just any investment firm. They were the architects behind some of Wall Street's most aggressive corporate takeovers. Victoria Chen was their senior managing director, a woman who'd earned her reputation by identifying undervalued assets and extracting maximum profit from them. "I'm listening," I said. "We've been watching Meridian Financial. More specifically, we've been watching the pattern of their successful deals over the past 18 months. There's a consistency to their best-performing investments that suggests a single analytical mind behind the decisions." I walked to my window, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness of Manhattan. "That's an interesting theory." "It's more than a theory. We've run the numbers. The deals that perform above market expectations all share certain characteristics: conservative risk assessment, thorough due diligence, accurate market positioning. The deals that underperform lack these qualities entirely." "And you think one person is responsible for this pattern?" "We know one person is responsible. The question is whether you're interested in a conversation about your future." The meeting was set for Thursday at 4 p.m. at a small cafe in Tribeca that most Wall Street executives wouldn't be caught dead in. The kind of place where serious conversations happened away from the gossip networks that fueled Manhattan's financial district. Victoria Chen was exactly what I'd expected: sharp suit, sharper eyes, and the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She was Asian American, probably mid-40s, with the confidence that came from surviving and thriving in an industry that didn't historically welcome women like her. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I'll be direct. We know you're the one behind Meridian's recent successes." I sipped my cappuccino. "I answer phones and schedule meetings." "You also restructured the Patterson Industries merger to avoid a $30 million tax liability that their original advisors missed. You identified the currency hedging strategy that saved the Singapore expansion project from a 15% loss when the yen fluctuated. And you spotted the regulatory issues with the European acquisition 3 weeks before Meridian's legal team even knew they existed." She slid a folder across the table. "We've been tracking the performance differential between deals you've touched and deals you haven't. The difference is statistically impossible to ignore." Inside the folder were detailed analyses of 12 major transactions, each one cross-referenced with dates, personnel assignments, and financial outcomes. The pattern was undeniable. Every deal that had involved my input, however unofficial, had significantly outperformed projections. "How did you get this information?" "We have people everywhere, Ms. Peterson, including at Meridian. What interests us isn't how you've been doing it, but why you've been hiding it." That was a question I'd been asking myself for months. Why was I content to remain invisible while Harrison took credit for my work? Why hadn't I leveraged my success into recognition and advancement? The answer was complicated. Part of it was strategic. I'd learned more about Meridian's operations by remaining underestimated than I ever would have in a senior position. Part of it was personal. There was something satisfying about proving that competence didn't require acknowledgement. But mostly, it was because I'd been waiting for the right opportunity, and Victoria Chen was offering exactly that. "What are you proposing?" "A partnership. Blackstone is launching a new division focused on mid-market acquisitions. We need someone who can identify opportunities that others miss, someone who understands the hidden dynamics of corporate transactions." She paused, studying my reaction. "We're prepared to offer you a managing director position, with a base salary of $800,000 and performance bonuses that could double that in the first year. Full autonomy over deal selection and structuring, with resources that dwarf anything you've had access to at Meridian." The offer was staggering. Not just the money, though that was significant, but the recognition. The acknowledgement that my skills were worth more than answering phones and organizing lunch meetings. "There's one condition," Victoria continued. "We need you to document everything you know about Meridian's operations. Deal structures, client relationships, internal processes, strategic plans, complete intelligence on how they operate." I set down my cup. You're planning a takeover. We're planning to compete. The financial services industry is consolidating, and firms like Meridian are either going to adapt or get absorbed. We'd prefer to give them the choice. And if they choose not to cooperate? Victoria's smile was cold. Then they'll learn that their best talent was sitting at the reception desk all along. The implications were clear. Blackstone wasn't just offering me a job, they were offering me revenge. The chance to leave Meridian and take their competitive advantages with me. The opportunity to prove that Harrison's success was built entirely on work he'd never understood. But there was something else in Victoria's proposal, something that excited me more than revenge or recognition. She was offering me the chance to build something new, to create a division that valued analytical rigor over political connections, substance over style. I need time to consider this. Of course, but don't take too long. The market is moving quickly, and opportunities like this don't wait for perfect timing. She stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. We know about your connection to Chairman Phillips. We're not concerned about potential conflicts of interest, but we thought you should know that your background check was quite thorough. After she left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, processing what had just happened. Victoria Chen had essentially offered me everything I'd been working toward: recognition, resources, and the chance to compete on my own terms. But accepting would mean leaving Meridian just as Harrison's fraud was about to be exposed. I'd spent months building the case against him, positioning myself as the solution to the problems he'd created. Walking away now would mean abandoning that work and letting someone else take credit for bringing him down. Unless there was another way. The next morning, I arrived at Meridian with a new sense of purpose. The Blackstone offer had crystallized something I'd been avoiding. I was wasting my talents in a company that didn't value them. But leaving immediately wasn't the answer. I needed to time my departure for maximum impact. Harrison was early, pacing around his office with the phone pressed to his ear. Through the glass, I could see the strain on his face, the way his free hand gestured frantically as he spoke. The board review was clearly not going well for him. "Carmel," he called when he spotted me. "I need the Yamamoto files, the complete transaction history." The Yamamoto deal was from 8 months ago, a Japanese real estate investment that had seemed promising until the market shifted. Harrison had structured it as a low-risk, high-yield opportunity, but I'd known from the beginning that the projections were overly optimistic. "I'll pull those immediately, sir." As I retrieved the files, I made copies of everything, not for Harrison's review but for my own records. The Yamamoto deal was another example of Harrison's fundamental incompetence, and it would be crucial evidence when the board finally decided to act. But more importantly, it was the kind of deal that Blackstone would want to understand. The mistakes Meridian had made, the opportunities they'd missed, the patterns that could be exploited by a more sophisticated competitor. I was beginning to see how I could have both revenge and opportunity. I could document Harrison's failures while simultaneously preparing for my own departure. I could expose the problems at Meridian while positioning myself as the solution that Blackstone needed. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. "Meridian Financial, this is Carmel." "Miss Peterson, this is David Kumar from the Wall Street Journal. I'm working on a story about emerging talent in financial services, and your name came up in several conversations. Would you be available for an interview?" I glanced around the reception area, ensuring I was alone. "I'm not sure what you mean. I'm an administrative assistant." "That's not what my sources tell me. I've been hearing about a woman at Meridian who's been quietly influencing some of their biggest deals. Someone who understands market dynamics better than most senior analysts." The call was unexpected but not unwelcome. Media attention would complicate my plans, but it might also accelerate them. If the Journal was investigating Meridian's operations, it wouldn't be long before they discovered Harrison's fraud. I'd be happy to talk, but it would have to be off the record. "Of course. Can we meet this afternoon?" The interview took place at another small cafe, this one in Midtown. David Kumar was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with the hungry look of a journalist who'd stumbled onto a bigger story than he'd initially realized. "Tell me about your role at Meridian," he began. I provide administrative support to the senior partners, scheduling, correspondence, general office management. But that's not all you do, is it? I chose my words carefully. In a smaller firm, everyone wears multiple hats. Sometimes I provide research assistance or analytical support when requested. My sources suggest it's more than that. They say you've been the primary architect behind several major deals, that your analysis has saved Meridian from significant losses on multiple occasions. I think your sources may be overstating my contributions. David leaned forward. What if I told you that I've been investigating irregularities in Meridian's consulting expenses? That I've found evidence of payments to firms that may not exist? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on Harrison's fraud that I hadn't considered the possibility that external investigators were already tracking the same patterns. I couldn't comment on internal financial matters. But you could comment on whether the firm's decision-making process accurately reflects the contributions of all its employees. That was a question I could answer honestly. I think many organizations struggle to recognize talent when it doesn't come from traditional sources. And you believe Meridian is one of those organizations? I believe any organization that dismisses people based on their job titles rather than their capabilities is making a strategic mistake. David took notes throughout our conversation, occasionally asking follow-up questions that suggested he knew more about Meridian's operations than he was revealing. When we finished, he handed me his card. If you ever decide you want to go on the record, call me. I have a feeling this story is going to be bigger than either of us realizes. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing everything that had happened in the past week. Victoria Chen's job offer, David Kumar's investigation, the mounting pressure on Harrison from the board review. The pieces were falling into place for a confrontation that would reshape not just my career, but Meridian's entire future. But I still had one more card to play, one more opportunity to demonstrate my value before the final reckoning arrived. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Victoria Chen, letting her know that I was interested in her offer but needed 2 more weeks to finalize my commitments at Meridian. The second was to David Kumar, providing him with anonymous tips about specific consulting payments that warranted further investigation. The third call was the most important. It was to a number I'd been saving for exactly this moment, to someone who could ensure that when Harrison finally fell, I would be positioned to catch him. This is Chairman Phillips. Sir, it's Carmel. We need to talk. It's about Harrison, and it's urgent. The meeting was set for that evening, at the chairman's private office in Midtown. Not the Meridian building, but his personal investment firm, where we could speak without fear of being overheard or recorded. As I prepared for that conversation, I realized that everything I'd worked for over the past months was about to culminate. The investigation, the evidence, the positioning, it was all leading to this moment when I would finally reveal not just Harrison's crimes, but my own capabilities. The woman Harrison had dismissed as, quote, just a secretary, was about to become the most important person in determining Meridian Financial's future. And she was ready. The first crack in Harrison's facade appeared on a Wednesday morning when Sterling Industries called to cancel their $180 million technology acquisition. I answered the phone myself, as always, but this time the conversation was different. Ms. Peterson, this is Richard Sterling. I need to speak with someone who actually understands our deal structure, not the pompous fool who's been pretending to handle our account. Sterling Industries was Harrison's crown jewel client, a tech conglomerate whose acquisitions had generated over $50 million in fees for Meridian over the past 3 years. Richard Sterling didn't make casual phone calls, and he certainly didn't insult senior partners without serious provocation. I'll connect you with Mr. Harrison immediately, sir. No, you won't. I want to talk to you. Word is getting around that you're the one who actually knows what she's doing over there. Can we meet? The meeting took place that afternoon at Sterling's private office in the Chrysler Building. The view from the 62nd floor was spectacular, but Richard Sterling's expression was anything but pleasant. He was a man in his 60s, built like a former linebacker, with the kind of presence that came from building a billion-dollar empire from scratch. Sit down, Carmel. We need to discuss it with your boss. He slid a folder across his mahogany desk. Inside were copies of Harrison's analysis reports for the Sterling Industries deals, marked up with red ink and harsh commentary. "These projections are garbage," Sterling said bluntly. "The risk assessments are amateurish, the market research is outdated, and the financial modeling wouldn't pass a freshman business class." But here's what's interesting. Every successful deal we've done with Meridian has involved corrections and modifications that came from someone else. He pulled out another set of documents. "These are the revised analyses we received after your boss submitted his initial work. Professional, thorough, accurate. Someone was fixing his mistakes before they reached my desk. I maintained my professional demeanor. Mr. Harrison works with a very capable team." "Cut the crap, Carmel. We both know it was you. The question is why you've been letting him take credit for your work." Sterling leaned back in his chair, studying me with the intensity of a man who'd built his fortune by reading people correctly. "I've been in business for 40 years. I know talent when I see it, and I know fraud when I smell it. Your boss is both incompetent and dishonest." "That's a serious accusation, sir." "It's a serious situation. Harrison has been billing us for consulting services that don't exist, recommending investments that benefit his personal portfolio, and presenting analysis that he clearly didn't prepare himself. If this continues, Sterling Industries will not only terminate our relationship with Meridian, but will also be filing complaints with the SEC and the financial conduct authorities." The implications were devastating. Sterling Industries represented nearly 20% of Meridian's revenue. Losing them would trigger a cascade of problems: other clients questioning their relationships, regulatory scrutiny, potential partnership dissolutions. "However," Sterling continued, "I'm prepared to give Meridian one more chance, on one condition." "What condition?" "All future communications go through you. No more dealing with Harrison, no more pretending he's the mastermind behind our transactions. I want direct access to the person who actually understands my business." It was an impossible request. I couldn't officially represent Meridian in client meetings without revealing that I'd been operating far beyond my supposed job description. But refusing would mean losing Sterling's business entirely. "I'll need to discuss this with senior management." "You have 24 hours. After that, we start looking for a new investment partner." That evening, I called Chairman Phillips at his private number. We'd agreed to meet later that week, but Sterling's ultimatum had accelerated our timeline. "We have a problem," I said without preamble. "Sterling Industries is threatening to leave unless Harrison is removed from their account." There was a long pause. "Richard called me this morning. He's furious about something, but he wouldn't give me details over the phone. It's about the consulting fraud. Sterling has documentation proving that Harrison has been billing for services that don't exist, and he's threatening to file regulatory complaints." "How do you know about this?" "Because I've been investigating it for months. Harrison has been stealing from the company through fake consulting firms, manipulating deal valuations for personal benefit, and systematically defrauding our clients." Another pause, longer this time. "We need to meet tonight. My office, 9 o'clock. The meeting with Chairman Phillips lasted 3 hours. I presented everything: the fake consulting firms, the offshore accounts, the doctored financial projections, the pattern of stolen credit for work I'd actually performed. Phillips listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional documentation. "How long have you known about this?" he asked finally. "I've suspected for months, but I only had concrete proof recently. I wanted to be certain before bringing it to your attention." "And why didn't you come to me sooner?" It was a fair question, one I'd been preparing to answer, because I needed to understand the full scope of the problem. If Harrison was just skimming money, that would be one thing, but he's been systematically undermining the company's relationships with its most important clients. Phillips nodded slowly. "Richard Sterling isn't the only one who's been asking questions. Margaret Chen from Pacific Investments called yesterday wondering why their deal analyses have been so inconsistent. David Wong from International Holdings has been complaining about the quality of our due diligence reports." The pattern was spreading. Harrison's incompetence was becoming visible to clients who'd previously been shielded by my behind-the-scenes corrections. "What's your recommendation?" Phillips asked. "Immediate suspension pending a full investigation. We need to review every deal Harrison has touched, every client relationship he's managed, every consulting payment he's authorized. And we need to do it before word spreads that Meridian's senior partners can't be trusted. And what about you? What role do you want in resolving this situation? It was the question I'd been hoping he'd ask. I want to do what I've been doing unofficially for months. Manage the client relationships, oversee the deal analyses, and ensure that our work meets professional standards. The only difference would be that it would finally be official. Philip smiled for the first time that evening. You realize that what you're describing is essentially Harrison's job? Yes, sir, I do. The next morning brought the beginning of Harrison's public downfall. Phillips called an emergency meeting of the senior partners, and by 10 o'clock, news of Harrison's suspension had spread throughout the company. I watched from my desk as Harrison was escorted from the building by security, a cardboard box of personal belongings in his arms. His face was pale, his usual confidence replaced by confusion and panic. As he passed my desk, he stopped. "You did this," he said quietly. "Somehow, you orchestrated this whole thing." I looked up from my computer, my expression professionally neutral. "I'm just a secretary, Mr. Harrison. I answer phones and schedule meetings." He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head and continued toward the elevator. The doors closed behind him, and I knew I'd never see him again as an employee of Meridian Financial. But his departure was only the beginning. The real work started immediately afterward. The first priority was damage control with existing clients. I spent the next 2 days on the phone with every major account, reassuring them that Meridian remained committed to providing excellent service and that any concerns about recent work quality would be addressed immediately. The conversations were revealing. Client after client expressed relief that they could finally speak directly with someone who understood their business needs. Several mentioned that they'd been frustrated with Harrison's approach, but had been reluctant to complain about a senior partner. "Thank God," said Jennifer Walsh from Technology Ventures. "Harrison never listened to our concerns about market timing. He just kept pushing deals that benefited his commission structure rather than our investment strategy." "Finally," said Marcus Rodriguez from Global Holdings, "someone who actually reads our requirements before making recommendations." By Friday, I'd not only retained every client who'd been threatening to leave, but had also received inquiries from 3 new potential accounts who'd heard about the personnel changes at Meridian. The second priority was investigating the full extent of Harrison's fraud. Phillips had hired a forensic accounting firm to review all transactions from the past 3 years, and their preliminary findings were staggering. Harrison had stolen over $3.2 million through fake consulting firms. He'd manipulated deal valuations to inflate his performance bonuses by an additional $800,000. He'd accepted kickbacks from investment targets in exchange for favorable recommendations, totaling another $1.5 million. But the financial fraud was only part of the problem. Harrison had also been systematically undermining the company's reputation through poor work quality, missed deadlines, and broken promises to clients. "It's worse than we thought," Phillips told me during our weekly review meeting. "Harrison wasn't just stealing money. He was destroying relationships that took decades to build." "How bad is the damage?" "Without the work you've been doing behind the scenes, we would have lost at least 6 major clients and probably faced regulatory action. The company would have been finished." The third priority was restructuring the senior management team to prevent similar problems in the future. Phillips proposed a solution that was both elegant and obvious: promote the people who'd actually been doing the work all along. "I'm recommending you for Senior Vice President of Client Relations," he said, "with full authority over deal structuring, client management, and quality control." It was everything I'd been working toward, but I found myself hesitating. What about the other partners? Won't they object to someone from outside the traditional management track being promoted so quickly? Let them object. After what happened with Harrison, the board is more interested in competence than credentials. Besides, you're hardly from outside the management track. You've been doing senior management work for months without the title or compensation. The promotion was announced the following Monday, along with news of Harrison's termination and the results of the fraud investigation. The press release was carefully worded to emphasize Meridian's commitment to ethical business practices and client service excellence. But the real impact was felt internally. The junior associates who'd been doing Harrison's actual work were finally getting recognition for their contributions. The administrative staff who'd been treated as invisible were suddenly being consulted on operational decisions. Most importantly, the culture of the company was changing. Instead of rewarding political connections and self-promotion, Meridian was beginning to value analytical rigor and client focus. "It's like a completely different place," said Sarah Martinez, one of the junior analysts. "People are actually listening to our research instead of just using it to support predetermined conclusions." "Finally," said David Chen, another associate, "we can do our jobs without worrying about some incompetent partner taking credit for our work." But not everyone was pleased with the changes. Several of Harrison's allies in the company began questioning the speed of my promotion and the extent of the investigation into his activities. "It's suspicious," I overheard Marcus Williams telling another partner. "How does a secretary suddenly become qualified to manage multi-million-dollar deals?" "She's obviously been planning this for months," replied Jennifer Walsh, "getting rid of Harrison so she could take his position." The whispers were predictable, but they were also irrelevant. My work spoke for itself, and the results were undeniable. Client satisfaction was up, deal quality was improving, and the company's reputation was being restored. More importantly, I had allies in places that mattered. Phillips supported my promotion completely, and the board was impressed with the improvements in client relationships and operational efficiency. But the real validation came from outside the company. David Kumar's article in the Wall Street Journal, published 3 weeks after Harrison's termination, painted a picture of systematic change at Meridian Financial. Under new management, the firm has transformed from a boys' club focused on personal connections to a meritocracy that rewards analytical excellence, the article read. Sources close to the company suggest that this transformation has been led by executives who were previously overlooked due to non-traditional career paths. The article didn't mention me by name, but it didn't need to. Anyone who understood the financial industry could read between the lines and see that something significant had changed at Meridian. Victoria Chin called the day after the article was published. "Congratulations on your promotion. I assume our conversation is no longer relevant." "Actually, I think it's more relevant than ever. Meridian is going to need strategic partners as we grow, and Blackstone might be exactly the kind of firm we should be working with." "Interesting. You're thinking about collaboration rather than competition?" "I'm thinking about building something bigger than any one company can create alone." It was a different conversation than the one we'd had months earlier, but it reflected how much had changed. I was no longer looking for an escape from Meridian. I was looking for ways to transform it into something better. As I prepared for the board meeting that would finalize Harrison's termination and formally approve my promotion, I reflected on everything that had happened. In less than 6 months, I'd gone from being dismissed as just a secretary to becoming one of the most important executives at a major financial firm. But more importantly, I'd proven that competence and integrity could triumph over politics and fraud. Harrison's downfall wasn't just personal revenge. It was a vindication of the idea that organizations succeed when they recognize and reward actual talent rather than superficial credentials. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., and I knew it would be the final act in Harrison's professional destruction. But it would also be the beginning of something new, a company that valued substance over style, results over relationships, and merit over manipulation. Harrison had called me just a secretary. Soon he'd learn that this secretary had just taken his job, his clients, and his reputation. And she was just getting started. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had never felt smaller. As I arranged my presentation materials on the polished mahogany table, I could feel the weight of 8 pairs of eyes studying my every movement. The board of directors of Meridian Financial wasn't just evaluating my promotion, they were deciding the future of the company itself. Chairman Phillips sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. To his right was Margaret Stevenson, the pension fund representative whose $2 billion in assets made her opinion invaluable. Robert Chen from the investment bank, Sarah Martinez from the insurance company, and 5 other directors who controlled the fate of hundreds of employees and thousands of clients. And at the far end of the table, looking like a man attending his own execution, sat Thomas Harrison. Phillips had insisted that Harrison attend the meeting to, quote, address the allegations personally. It was a courtesy that Harrison didn't deserve, but one that would make his downfall more complete. There's something particularly devastating about being destroyed in front of the people you'd spent years trying to impress. Ladies and gentlemen, Phillips began, we're here to review the findings of the forensic investigation into irregularities in our consulting expenses and deal management procedures. Ms. Peterson will present the evidence. I stood, activating the wall-mounted display screen. The first slide showed a simple organizational chart, Harrison's supposed area of responsibility, with deal values and client names clearly marked. Over the past 36 months, the deals managed by Mr. Harrison generated approximately $847 million in client value and $23.4 million in fees for Meridian Financial, I began. However, our investigation has revealed significant discrepancies between reported activities and actual performance. Harrison shifted in his chair, his lawyer, a nervous-looking man from a mid-tier firm, whispering urgently in his ear. They'd clearly expected a personnel review, not a forensic presentation with hard evidence. The second slide showed consulting payments. Neat rows of invoices, each one meticulously documented with dates, amounts, and supposed services rendered. These payments, totaling $3.2 million, were authorized by Mr. Harrison for consulting services from various firms. I clicked to the next slide. However, as you can see, these firms exist only on paper. The evidence was devastating in its simplicity. Apex Analytics, a Delaware mail drop. Sterling Consulting Group, a virtual office in Nevada. Pacific Research Partners, a phone number that went to voicemail. Each one a shell company designed to funnel Meridian's money into Harrison's personal accounts. Board member Robert Chen leaned forward. Ms. Peterson, how did you discover these irregularities? I began noticing inconsistencies in invoice patterns approximately 4 months ago. The consulting reports being delivered didn't match the supposed expertise of the firms being paid. When I investigated further, I found that the firms either didn't exist or had no employees with relevant qualifications. And you investigated this on your own initiative? Yes, sir. As part of my administrative duties, I process these payments and maintain vendor relationships. It's my responsibility to ensure that Meridian's expenses are legitimate. Harrison's lawyer chose that moment to interrupt. This is highly irregular. My client wasn't informed that he would be facing accusations of this nature. We demand time to prepare a proper response. Margaret Stevenson's voice cut through the room like ice. Mr. Harrison has had 3 weeks to prepare since his suspension. If he has explanations for these payments, we'd like to hear them now. All eyes turned to Harrison. For a man who'd built his career on smooth talking and confident presentations, he looked remarkably unprepared. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit rumpled, his famous composure nowhere to be found. The consulting expenses were legitimate business costs, he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. These firms provided valuable market research and competitive analysis that contributed to our deal's success. I clicked to the next slide. A detailed breakdown of the supposed consulting deliverables versus actual work performed. According to the invoices, Apex Analytics provided 340 hours of market research for the Hartwell acquisition. However, the analysis that was actually used in that deal was prepared internally by our junior associates. I highlighted specific sections of text. In fact, several paragraphs of the Apex report were copied directly from publicly available SEC filings. Harrison's face was growing redder by the minute. Market research often incorporates public information. That doesn't invalidate the analysis. You're correct, I replied smoothly. However, this does. The next slide showed bank records, wire transfers from Meridian's accounts to the shell companies, followed by immediate transfers to offshore accounts controlled by Harrison. The money trail was undeniable, documented down to the penny. Sarah Martinez spoke for the first time. Mr. Harrison, can you explain why payments to these consulting firms were immediately transferred to accounts under your control? Harrison's lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but Harrison waved him away. Those transfers were reimbursements for expenses I'd advanced on behalf of the consulting firms. Reimbursements totaling $3.2 million? Robert Chen's tone was incredulous. What possible expenses could justify advances of that magnitude? Travel costs, research fees, technology infrastructure. Harrison's voice trailed off as he realized how implausible his explanation sounded. I clicked to the next slide. Our investigation found no evidence of any travel, research, or technology expenses related to these consulting projects. In fact, we found evidence of the opposite. The slide showed Harrison's personal credit card statements. Luxury vacations charged during periods when he was supposedly coordinating with consulting firms, expensive restaurant bills for client meetings that had actually been personal dinners, shopping sprees at high-end retailers justified as professional wardrobe expenses. Furthermore, I continued, several of the supposed consulting projects were completed during periods when Mr. Harrison was out of the office on personal travel. The evidence was overwhelming, but I wasn't finished. The financial fraud was only part of Harrison's incompetence. I needed to show the board that he'd also been systematically undermining the company's client relationships. The consulting fraud represents a serious breach of fiduciary responsibility, I said, moving to a new section of slides. However, our investigation also revealed patterns of negligence and misrepresentation that put Meridian's reputation at risk. The next slides showed deal analyses, Harrison's original work compared to the corrections that had been made before presentations to clients. The differences were striking. Harrison's projections were consistently over-optimistic, his risk assessments dangerously inadequate, his market research outdated, or simply wrong. These corrections were made by junior staff members working under my supervision, I explained. In many cases, the final presentations bore little resemblance to Mr. Harrison's original analysis. Board member Margaret Stevenson was taking extensive notes. Ms. Peterson, are you saying that Mr. Harrison's work was routinely corrected before being presented to clients? Yes, ma'am. In fact, I maintain detailed records of these corrections, going back 18 months. I clicked through a series of examples. The Morrison Industries deal, where Harrison had missed obvious regulatory issues. The Patterson acquisition, where his financial modeling had contained basic mathematical errors. The Singapore expansion, where he'd failed to account for currency fluctuation risks. Without these corrections, Meridian would have faced significant losses and potential legal liability, I continued. Several clients have privately expressed concerns about the quality of analysis they were receiving. Harrison finally exploded. This is ridiculous. I've generated millions in revenue for this company. A few administrative errors don't invalidate years of successful deal-making. Administrative errors? I clicked to a new slide showing client communications. Sterling Industries threatened to terminate their relationship with Meridian, specifically because of concerns about your work quality. Pacific Investments delayed 3 deals because they couldn't rely on your analysis. Global Holdings requested that all future communications go through alternative channels. The slide showed a timeline of client complaints, each one carefully documented with dates, amounts at risk, and resolution methods. The pattern was clear. Harrison's incompetence had been driving away business that I'd been working frantically to retain. In fact, I added, our client retention rate improved by 23% after Mr. Harrison's suspension, and we've received inquiries from 4 new potential clients who had previously been reluctant to work with Meridian. Robert Chen leaned back in his chair. Ms. Peterson, if you've been managing these client relationships and correcting these analytical errors, what exactly was Mr. Harrison contributing to these deals? It was the question I'd been waiting for. Primarily, Mr. Harrison provided client presentations and external communications. However, the substance of those presentations was prepared by other staff members. Other staff members working under your direction? Yes, sir. The implication was obvious to everyone in the room. Harrison had been taking credit for work he hadn't done, stealing money from the company and actively damaging client relationships. Meanwhile, I had been quietly holding the entire operation together. Harrison's lawyer made one last desperate attempt. These allegations are based on incomplete information and personal animosity. My client has been a valuable contributor to Meridian's success, and any irregularities in consulting expenses can be explained and resolved. Chairman Phillips spoke for the first time since the presentation began. Mr. Harrison, do you have any evidence to support your lawyer's claims? Any documentation showing that you personally conducted the analysis work you've been taking credit for? Harrison's silence was damning. After 30 seconds, Phillips continued. Do you have any explanation for the offshore accounts that received the consulting payments? Any documentation showing legitimate business purposes for these transfers? More silence. Do you have any response to the client complaints that have been documented by Ms. Peterson? Harrison's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear again, but Harrison had clearly given up. His shoulders slumped, his confident facade finally cracking completely. The consulting arrangements were complicated. There may have been some irregularities in the documentation, but my intentions were always to benefit the company. It was a pathetic attempt at damage control, and everyone in the room knew it. Margaret Stevenson was the first to speak. Mr. Harrison, these aren't irregularities. This is systematic fraud, coupled with professional incompetence that could have destroyed this company's reputation. Sarah Martinez nodded. The evidence is overwhelming. The question isn't whether Mr. Harrison is guilty of these actions, but how we prevent similar problems in the future. Robert Chen was more direct. Mr. Harrison, you're terminated effective immediately. We'll be referring this matter to the appropriate authorities for criminal prosecution. Harrison's face went white. You can't do this. I have contracts. I have rights. You forfeited those rights when you decided to steal from your own company, Phillips replied coldly. Security will escort you from the building after this meeting concludes. But I wasn't finished. There was one more revelation that would complete Harrison's destruction and establish my own position beyond any doubt. There's one additional matter the board should be aware of, I said, clicking to a final slide. The slide showed a photograph, Harrison and a woman I didn't recognize, sitting at an expensive restaurant clearly engaged in intimate conversation. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 weeks ago, while Harrison was supposed to be conducting due diligence on a major acquisition. Our investigation revealed that Mr. Harrison has been sharing confidential client information with Elena Rodriguez, a competitive intelligence analyst working for Blackstone Capital Management. The room erupted. Board members turned to each other in shock, while Harrison's face went from white to green. This photograph was taken at Le Bernardin, where Mr. Harrison disclosed details about Meridian's upcoming acquisitions to Ms. Rodriguez. Phone records show they've been in regular contact for 6 months. Harrison was now visibly shaking. That's not what it looks like. Elena and I have a personal relationship. Any business discussions were casual, not intentional disclosure. Mr. Harrison, I continued relentlessly, Elena Rodriguez was specifically tasked by Blackstone with gathering intelligence about Meridian's client strategies. The information you provided has already been used to undercut our competitive positioning on 3 major deals. It was the final nail in Harrison's professional coffin. Not only had he been stealing money and performing incompetently, he'd been actively betraying the company to its competitors. The boardroom fell silent except for the sound of Harrison's heavy breathing. After several minutes, Chairman Phillips spoke. Mr. Harrison, you're finished. Not just at Meridian, but in this industry. We'll be filing criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and professional conduct complaints that will ensure you never work in financial services again. Harrison stood shakily, his lawyer gathering papers with the haste of someone eager to escape. As they reached the door, Harrison turned back. This isn't over, he said, his voice hoarse. You've destroyed my career, my reputation, my life. I met his gaze steadily. No, Mr. Harrison. You destroyed your own career the moment you decided to steal from the company and betray our clients. I simply documented what you'd done. The door closed behind him, and I knew I'd never see Thomas Harrison again. But the real business of the meeting was just beginning. With Harrison gone, the board needed to make decisions about Meridian's future, and my role in it. Chairman Phillips turned to me with something that might have been pride in his eyes. Ms. Peterson, the board has a proposition for you. Ms. Peterson, Chairman Phillips continued, his voice carrying the weight of corporate history. The board has voted unanimously to offer you the position of Executive Vice President of Strategic Operations, effective immediately. The words hung in the air like expensive perfume. Executive Vice President. A position that would make me the 3rd most powerful person at Meridian Financial, with authority over deal structuring, client relations, and operational oversight. It was more than Harrison had ever achieved, more than he'd ever dreamed of achieving. Margaret Stevenson leaned forward. The compensation package includes a base salary of $950,000, performance bonuses that could reach $2 million annually, full equity participation, and a seat on the executive committee. Robert Chen added, "You'll also have complete autonomy to restructure the client services division, hire your own team, and implement whatever operational changes you deem necessary." Sarah Martinez smiled for the first time during the meeting. "Frankly, Ms. Peterson, you've been doing this job unofficially for months. We're simply making it official and paying you what you're worth." I looked around the table at 8 of the most powerful people in Manhattan's financial district. 6 months ago, these same individuals wouldn't have given me a second glance as I served coffee during their meetings. Now they were offering me more money and authority than I'd ever imagined possible. But there was something else in their offer, something that went beyond salary and title. They were offering me vindication, public, undeniable recognition that the woman Harrison had dismissed as just a secretary was actually the most valuable employee in the company. "I accept," I said simply. The boardroom erupted in applause, and for a moment I allowed myself to savor the irony. Harrison's attempt to humiliate me had ultimately led to his destruction and my elevation. His casual cruelty had motivated me to build a case so comprehensive that it not only destroyed his career, but revealed my own capabilities to the people who mattered most. "There is one additional matter," Phillips said as the applause died down. "The board has also voted to pursue criminal charges against Mr. Harrison for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. We'll need your continued cooperation with law enforcement." "Of course," I replied. "I've already prepared comprehensive documentation for the district attorney's office." As the board members began to file out, each one stopping to congratulate me personally, I reflected on the magnitude of what had just occurred. In less than 4 hours, I'd gone from administrative assistant to executive vice president, while simultaneously destroying the man who'd tried to destroy me. But Harrison's humiliation wasn't complete yet. There was still one more act to this drama, one final moment that would cement his fall from grace. 3 days later, the Wall Street Journal published David Kumar's follow-up story under the headline, "From Secretary to Executive, The Rise of Carmel Peterson." The article detailed Harrison's fraud, his termination, and my promotion, painting a picture of corporate justice that resonated throughout the financial industry. In an era when Wall Street is often criticized for rewarding connections over competence, Kumar wrote, "Meridian Financial's promotion of Carmel Peterson represents a return to meritocratic principles." Peterson, who began as an administrative assistant, identified and documented systematic fraud while simultaneously managing client relationships and deal analyses that generated hundreds of millions in revenue. The article included quotes from clients praising my work, board members explaining their decision, and industry analysts discussing the broader implications for corporate governance. But the most satisfying quote came from Sterling Industries' Richard Sterling. "Carmel Peterson is exactly the kind of professional that the financial industry needs more of. She combines analytical brilliance with ethical integrity. And she's been doing executive-level work while being paid administrative wages. Her promotion isn't charity. It's long overdue recognition of exceptional talent." The story went viral within hours. LinkedIn posts, Twitter threads, and industry publications all picked up the narrative of the underestimated secretary who'd brought down a corrupt executive while transforming herself into a corporate leader. But the real impact was felt at Meridian itself. Within a week of my promotion, applications for junior positions increased by 300%. Top talent from competing firms began inquiring about opportunities. Client interest in new deals reached levels the company hadn't seen in years. "It's remarkable," said Jennifer Walsh, one of the junior associates I'd been quietly mentoring. "People actually want to work here now. They see what happened to you and think, maybe my contributions will be recognized too." The cultural transformation was even more dramatic. The old boys network that had protected Harrison was being systematically dismantled. Performance reviews began focusing on actual results rather than political connections. Junior staff were being promoted based on merit rather than pedigree. Most importantly, the company was making money. Lots of money. My first quarter as EVP saw Meridian's revenue increase by 34%, driven primarily by improved client retention and new business acquisition. The deals I'd been secretly optimizing for months were now being properly executed from the beginning, resulting in better outcomes for clients and higher fees for the firm. But success brought new challenges. The financial industry is small and gossipy, and Harrison's supporters weren't going quietly into the night. "She's clearly sleeping with Chairman Phillips," I heard one competitor whisper at an industry conference. "How else could a secretary become an executive overnight?" "It's all smoke and mirrors," another added. "She probably planted evidence to frame Harrison and make herself look good." The rumors were predictable and pathetic, but they were also dangerous. In an industry built on relationships and reputation, even false accusations could damage careers. That's when I decided to make a public statement that would silence the whispers permanently. The venue was the annual Women in Finance Leadership Summit, held at the Plaza Hotel. 500 of the industry's most powerful women gathered to discuss career advancement, workplace equity, and professional development. It was the perfect audience for what I needed to say. 6 months ago, I began, a senior executive at my company told me I was just a secretary and should know my place. He was right about one thing. I did need to know my place. But my place wasn't answering his phones or scheduling his meetings. My place was identifying his crimes, documenting his incompetence, and ensuring that justice was served. The audience was rapt. I'd prepared extensively for this speech, knowing it would define how the industry perceived my rise. Thomas Harrison called me just a secretary because he couldn't imagine that someone without an Ivy League MBA could understand complex financial transactions. He couldn't conceive that a woman who brought him coffee could also restructure multi-million-dollar deals. He couldn't believe that the person who organized his calendar was also organizing his downfall. I paused, looking out at an audience that included CEOs, senior partners, and board directors from every major firm on Wall Street. But here's what Harrison never understood. Competence doesn't require credentials. Intelligence doesn't demand recognition. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes is powerless. The applause was thunderous. Women who'd faced similar dismissals and underestimation recognized something of themselves in my story. Senior executives realized they might want to pay more attention to the talented people working beneath their notice. But the most satisfying moment came during the networking reception afterward, when Victoria Chen from Blackstone approached me. "Congratulations on your promotion," she said with a smile. "I have to admit, when we first met, I thought we were recruiting you away from Meridian. I never imagined you'd end up running the place." "I'm not running it yet," I replied, "but give me time." Victoria laughed. "Actually, that's why I wanted to talk to you. Blackstone is looking for strategic partners on some upcoming deals. Firms with strong analytical capabilities and ethical leadership. Interested in a conversation?" It was a complete reversal from our original meeting. 6 months ago, Victoria had been trying to poach me from a company I felt trapped in. Now she was proposing partnership between equals, recognizing Meridian and me as valuable allies rather than acquisition targets. "I'd be very interested," I said. "But this time, we'll be negotiating from a position of strength. The real measure of victory isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something better than what they tried to tear down." Harrison's downfall was satisfying, but creating a legacy that would outlast both of us was the true prize. 1 year after my promotion, I stood in the lobby of the newly renovated Meridian Financial Headquarters, watching as the bronze plaque was installed near the elevators. It read simply, "Excellence is not determined by position, but by performance. Opportunity is not granted, but earned. Respect is not demanded, but demonstrated." The renovation itself told the story of Meridian's transformation. Gone were the intimidating marble facades and exclusive executive floors. In their place were open collaborative spaces, mentorship areas, and training facilities designed to develop talent regardless of background. But the physical changes were just symbols of deeper transformations. The Meridian Leadership Development Program, which I designed and launched 6 months earlier, was already producing results. 24 young professionals from diverse backgrounds, including several former administrative assistants, were being trained in advanced financial analysis, client management, and ethical decision-making. This program wouldn't have existed under the old management, said Maria Santos, a former receptionist who is now a junior analyst specializing in emerging markets. They would have said I didn't have the right education or connections. But Carmel saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. The program was attracting attention from across the industry. Harvard Business School had requested case studies. The Financial Times had featured it in a cover story about corporate culture change. Other firms were attempting to replicate our model. But the program was just one part of a larger vision. I was building Meridian into something unprecedented in the financial industry, a firm that valued substance over style, results over relationships, and character over credentials. The Meridian Innovation Lab was another component. Housed on the 38th floor, it brought together quantitative analysts, technology specialists, and market researchers to develop new approaches to investment analysis and risk management. We're not just following industry trends, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, whom I'd promoted to head of research. We're creating them. Our predictive models are 2 years ahead of anything else on the market. The lab's first major breakthrough was an AI-powered system that could identify potential fraud in investment prospectuses with 94% accuracy. When we demonstrated it at the International Finance Technology Conference, representatives from the SEC requested immediate briefings. This technology could revolutionize regulatory oversight, said Commissioner Patricia Martinez. If we can identify fraudulent schemes before they damage investors, we could prevent the next Enron or Madoff scandal. But technology was only part of the equation. The human element, the culture of ethical excellence that I'd been building, was equally important. The Meridian Ethics Institute, established in partnership with Columbia Law School, was training the next generation of financial professionals to recognize and prevent the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed our company. Ethics isn't just about following rules, I told the first class of Institute participants. It's about understanding that every decision you make affects real people with real lives. When you recommend an investment, you're gambling with someone's retirement. When you structure a deal, you're shaping economic outcomes for thousands of employees. That responsibility should inform every choice you make. The Institute's curriculum included case studies of financial fraud, including detailed analysis of Harrison's schemes. Students learned not just how to identify corruption, but how to build systems that prevent it from occurring. The Harrison case is particularly instructive, explained Professor Michael Chen, the Institute's director, because it demonstrates how systematic fraud can be hidden within legitimate business operations. Students learn to recognize the warning signs that Carmel Peterson identified: unexplained consulting expenses, inconsistent work quality, defensive reactions to questions about methodology. By the end of my second year as EVP, Meridian had become something entirely different from the company Harrison had tried to run. Revenue had increased by 127%. Client satisfaction scores reached industry-leading levels. Employee retention improved dramatically, while recruitment attracted top talent from across the financial sector. But the most meaningful changes were personal rather than professional. The administrative staff, who'd been invisible under Harrison's leadership, were now recognized as crucial team members. Their insights about client preferences, market trends, and operational efficiency were actively sought and valued. I used to dread coming to work, said Patricia Williams, the executive assistant to our senior partners. The old management treated us like furniture, useful, but unworthy of consideration. Now I feel like my observations and suggestions actually matter. The junior associates who'd been doing Harrison's work while he took credit were finally receiving recognition for their contributions. Several had been promoted to senior positions, while others had been recruited by competing firms, seeking to replicate Meridian's success. Carmel changed everything, said Marcus Rodriguez, now a senior vice president specializing in international acquisitions. Under Harrison, we were just cogs in a machine designed to generate his commissions. Now we're partners in building something meaningful. But perhaps the most satisfying transformation was in Meridian's relationship with its clients. Companies that had been considering leaving during Harrison's tenure became some of our strongest advocates. Meridian, under Carmel Peterson's leadership, represents everything we want in a financial partner, said Richard Sterling during a client appreciation event. Analytical rigor, ethical integrity, and genuine commitment to our success rather than their own profit margins. The event was held at the Museum of Natural History, in the Hayden Planetarium. As I looked up at the simulated stars, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 3 years earlier, I'd been a dismissed secretary, humiliated by a man who couldn't imagine that I had any value beyond administrative tasks. Now I was leading one of the most respected financial firms in Manhattan, speaking at industry conferences, and building programs that would influence the next generation of financial professionals. But the real victory wasn't personal success. It was the demonstration that organizations succeed when they recognize and develop talent regardless of its source. The final validation came during Meridian's 3rd annual Leadership Summit, held at the Waldorf Astoria. 500 clients, partners, and industry leaders gathered to celebrate the firm's transformation and discuss future opportunities. The keynote address was delivered by Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, who praised Meridian's approach to ethical leadership and innovative analysis. In an industry often criticized for prioritizing short-term profits over long-term stability, Powell said, Meridian Financial under Carmel Peterson's leadership represents a return to the fundamental principles that make financial markets work: trust, competence, and accountability. After the formal program ended, I found myself in conversation with a group of young professionals who'd been inspired by Meridian's story. "How did you do it?" asked Sarah Kim, a recent graduate who'd just started at Goldman Sachs. "How did you go from secretary to executive while simultaneously exposing fraud and transforming an entire company culture?" It was a question I'd been asked many times, and I'd developed a standard response about hard work, preparation, and patience. But that evening, surrounded by the next generation of financial leaders, I decided to give a more complete answer. I did it by understanding that every position, no matter how humble it appears, offers opportunities to learn, to contribute, and to build relationships, I said. Harrison saw me as just a secretary because he couldn't imagine that someone in that role could have strategic insight or analytical capabilities. But titles don't determine talent, and position doesn't define potential. I paused, looking around at the group of eager young faces. More importantly, I did it by focusing on doing excellent work rather than seeking recognition for that work. For months, I corrected Harrison's mistakes, managed client relationships, and prevented disasters without receiving any credit. But that work built competence, demonstrated value, and created a foundation for everything that followed. "But wasn't it frustrating?" asked another participant. "Watching someone else take credit for your accomplishments?" "Absolutely," I admitted, "but frustration can be a powerful motivator if you channel it correctly." Instead of getting angry about Harrison's behavior, I used it as evidence of systemic problems that needed to be addressed. His fraud and incompetence weren't just personal failings. They were symptoms of a culture that valued appearance over substance. The conversation continued for another hour, with questions about corporate culture, ethical leadership, and career development. As the evening wound down, I realized that this, sharing knowledge, developing talent, inspiring the next generation, was the most important part of my legacy. The final moment of vindication came 6 months later, during the annual Financial Industry Leadership Awards ceremony. The event, held at Lincoln Center, brings together the most influential figures in global finance to recognize exceptional contributions to the industry. "The award for transformational leadership," announced the presenter, "goes to someone who has redefined what it means to build value in the financial services industry. Through ethical innovation, cultural transformation, and unwavering commitment to excellence, this year's recipient has created a model for principled success that will influence the industry for generations to come." I knew I'd won before they announced my name, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of 2,000 industry leaders was still profoundly moving. As I walked to the podium to accept the award, I thought about Thomas Harrison. He was probably watching from wherever disgraced executives go to nurse their wounds and plot unlikely comebacks. I hoped he was seeing this moment, understanding finally that the woman he'd dismissed as just a secretary had built something extraordinary from the ruins of his career. "When Thomas Harrison told me I was just a secretary," I said in my acceptance speech, "he was revealing more about his limitations than mine. He couldn't see beyond job titles to recognize talent. He couldn't imagine that someone he'd dismissed might actually be more capable than he was." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. But his blindness became my opportunity. While he was taking credit for work he didn't do and stealing money from clients who trusted him, I was learning, building, and preparing for the moment when his house of cards would collapse. I held up the Crystal Award, letting the stage lights catch its faceted surface. This award isn't just recognition of my work. It's validation of a principle that should guide every organization. Excellence exists at every level, and the most dangerous mistake a leader can make is assuming that position equals capability. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Later that evening, at the awards reception, I was approached by a familiar figure, Victoria Chen from Blackstone, but she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a young woman who looked nervous but determined. "Carmel, I'd like you to meet Amanda Foster," Victoria said. "She's currently working as an administrative coordinator at our Boston office, but she's been developing some fascinating insights about emerging market trends." I studied Amanda Foster's face, seeing something of my younger self in her expression, intelligence masked by professional invisibility, ambition tempered by realistic assessment of limited opportunities. "What kind of insights?" I asked. "I've been tracking correlation patterns between social media sentiment and currency fluctuations in developing economies," Amanda said, her initial nervousness giving way to enthusiasm as she described her work. "I think there are predictive opportunities that current models are missing." "That sounds like exactly the kind of innovative thinking that drives market advantages," I replied. "Have you considered applying for our next leadership development program cohort?" Amanda's eyes widened. I didn't know I would be qualified. I don't have an MBA or traditional financial experience." "Neither did I," said with a smile. "What you have is intelligence, curiosity, and the willingness to look for patterns that others miss. That's more valuable than any credential." As I handed Amanda my business card, I realized that this was how legacies are truly built, not through personal achievement, but through creating opportunities for others to achieve their own success. 6 months later, Amanda Foster joined Meridian as a junior analyst specializing in emerging market prediction. Within a year, her models had generated over $50 million in additional revenue for our clients. And somewhere, I hoped, Thomas Harrison was watching and finally understanding what he'd lost when he dismissed the most valuable employee in his company as just a secretary. The woman he'd humiliated had not only taken his job and destroyed his career, she'd built something infinitely better than anything he could have imagined. She'd built a legacy of excellence that would outlast them both. And she was just getting started. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.